Morning, everybody. Last day of the show. Tired? I'm tired. Thank you for coming on the last day and the first session. I appreciate it. My name is Tim Hewer. I'm one of the program managers for the XAML team and the features being delivered in Windows 8 for Metro-style applications. If you just a quicker introduction, I've been involved in the XAML platform for about 4 years now. Started with the Silverlight team, and then over the past year, been working on the features to deliver for the Metro-style apps. I currently work in, my team works in the data binding parser, the WinRT layer, and the developer tools for Windows 8 XAML applications. So this is a tips and tricks session. This is not an overview of any one specific feature or deliverable. Hopefully that you have had an opportunity to go to some of the other sessions for our team. So I'm required to show an agenda slide. I'll show an agenda slide. I've had to reimagine the agenda slide so you can see the changes there. But the idea is that we're just going to go through some demos. Our team has been working on the XAML platform for a while. You saw a lot of different features, hopefully this week, in talking about the grid view, the list view, other aspects of the XAML platform, some things that are new, the notion of contracts, how do you make your app light up. And so a lot of tips and tricks actually were talked about in some of those things as well. We met as a team and decided, as we were going through our app building and things like that, what did we discover? What did we find that were some of the gotchas that if you're coming from an existing XAML platform or new to XAML in some areas and new to data binding in some areas, what would be helpful? So we came up with this list of, in the time allotted, what we thought would be, we picked 10 tips that we thought would be good, and so I'm just going to go through them very quickly. So as I mentioned, this is not a substitute for any of the other XAML or Windows 8 sessions that cover our platform. I strongly suggest that you review Joe Stegman's overview talk, and I think the recordings are actually coming on very quickly, so if you weren't able to go to that session, I think a lot of the day one sessions are already up there. I looked this morning and there was quite a few, and even some of yesterday's are starting to pop up as well. So for a broad overview of kind of what's new from a XAML developer's perspective, I encourage you to view Joe Stegman's talk, and then the deeper dives from all the other members of my team. So with that, let's just get started. I hope to actually have plenty of time for questions as well. So this is kind of the last of the XAML sessions. You may have, as you've been playing with your tablet and maybe building some apps, or haven't been able to find one of the team members in the expo hall or something like that. I wanted to make sure that if you did have some questions, that you at least have a point of contact. And so I think we'll be okay, and we'll be able to have an opportunity for questions at the end. If you see something that's confusing during this session, again, this is more of just a tour of some things. Feel free to shout it out, and we can walk through it together. So there's a couple that I want to talk to before I show them, and the first one is the frame rate counter. How many people are actually coming from an existing XAML experience? Okay, so quite a bit. So if you're familiar with Silverlight or the phone, you know that we have an existing frame rate counter, and it provides good information for debugging. But you're able to, it's actually exposed in the API that you can turn it on or off. Because the hosting model is a little different. Well, we do have a frame rate counter for Windows Metro-style XAML apps, and this is what it looks like. There's some numbers that are different, and I'll show it in a second. But I wanted to kind of just, and these slides will be available for download, so don't bother trying to write down the numbers. So we do have a frame rate counter. The first three numbers, I think, are probably going to be the most important for you as you're going throughout developing your applications. The composition thread and the UI thread frame rates are probably what most people use in the frame rate counter, and understanding what those are, and watching them as you're doing animations. John talked about dependent and independent animations, and you'll see that these are the areas where you can see those impacts of what you're doing for the differences between dependent and independent animations. And the third is kind of like the memory utilization, well, not kind of, it is the memory utilization for your application. And we'll be actually able to demonstrate the memory utilization portion and how that's helpful for us in one of the later tips. But just to set the stage, the other should be self-explanatory, with the exception of batch count. If you have questions about that, come see me afterwards. It's not totally relevant to kind of mainstream use cases. We currently don't have a way to turn it on via an API mechanism. So this is kind of this is the classic reg key secret ninja hack trick. We're not trying to hide it with some obfuscated name, of course. It's enable frame rate counter. These are the two areas, 32-bit and 64-bit, where you would enable these. Yes, quick question. So if you have, sorry, the question is it available natively on 64-bit? If you're creating a C# application, as an example, by default, when we compile the C# application, we use any CPU 32-bit preferred, and so it's running under WoW. But yeah, if you put it under the 64-bit node and you're running an architecture-specific application, it should work. Good question. So again, these slides will be available, so you can copy and paste that. And actually, as we go through these tips, at the appendix of this slide deck, I kind of recap all the code snippets that I'll show. So I'm going to try not to toggle too much back and forth as far as making this a slide presentation. But this deck that you can download later actually has every tip that I cover has the code snippet that I'm using and some background around it there. So let's take a look at this. And I'm just going to turn it on. Again, I'm just using reg files to turn it on. We are looking at ways to make this API specific, so you can kind of do, if I'm attached to a debugger, automatically turn it on and things like that. And I'm going to launch an application here. Zero Gravity. So Zero Gravity is a former Silverlight game that's been transferred. And you can see that as we go about and do things throughout the game, how the frame rate counter can react and the memory utilization. So we're holding out some good composition thread frame rates and things like that. There are some nuances. So right now, the reason why you're seeing a black screen is I'm actually playing media. And there are some current conflicts with the frame rate counter and as you're playing back media. So just heads up on that. Your app's not crashing, but if that's happening in your application, that's something to know. So this is more of a tip of just knowing that it's there and how to turn it on. This is a very valuable tool when you get to fine-tuning and doing your performance of your application. Oh. Not in this one. OK. Ken, I don't know if we can fix that at this time, but OK, good to know. Thank you. OK, the second thing I want to talk about is exception handling. So you've heard a lot that WinRT is, the APIs provided by WinRT are native APIs, right? So they're, and XAML, WinRT XAML, by the nature of what we've been calling it this week, is a WinRT API. So every UI element that you're using and anything in windows.ui.xaml is a native API that you're using and calling. So as a XAML developer working in the managed world, you're probably used to how you handle exceptions, how .NET surfaces exceptions, and things like that. In WinRT, things can be a little bit different in exceptions, especially if you're writing a C# application using WinRT. You're kind of mixing those modes. So there's an easy way and a recommendation that I do in every time I write an application or to get started in an application to ensure that I can make sure that I'm seeing actually all exceptions that are happening. And so let me show you just two different scenarios and things that you can do. One thing that I did want to call out too, there's been some confusion that I've been seeing in the forums. This is just a standard blank application. You'll notice that the references node is blank. How many people have had questions about this as they've been looking? Tried to add a reference and nothing's there. So if you haven't realized, in the tools, we decided that the WinRT surface area in the SDK and the .NET profile for Windows 8 is small enough that we are doing what we're calling implicit references. So we're including all the references for you. The only references you need in your application are the ones that you are specifically consuming from third parties, your other projects, or other APIs. So we're interested in feedback around that. This story is currently different for C++, where they're not implicit reference in C++. If you saw the reference dialog, you would see all of them explicitly added. But we felt that was a helpful thing for developers. If you've never used Object Browser before, this is going to be your best friend and kind of your documentation. So you can see all the APIs that are available. A lot of people always try to think where they know the API is and not realize you can just quickly search by any keyword and try to find it. So just a quick note on that. I saw that that's tripped some people up. So let me run this application. And let me get rid of the frame rate counter for now. And I have two things that I know will throw two different types of exceptions. So I'm just going to throw an unhandled exception, which is in the code. This is just throw argument null. And so you can see my application is still running, right? So as a developer, as I'm debugging, I'm probably clicking my button wondering why my function is not happening. And because if you don't have a dual mon situation and you don't have the Metro style app on one screen and Visual Studio on the other, you're probably not going to always see this interaction, right? This is a different kind of debugging experience than we're used to, where we have windowed experiences and we always can see the watch window with our left eye and that type of thing. So in this mode, if I actually do go back to Visual Studio, I see that there is an exception that was output to the output window here. Now, one of the tips that I'd recommend is we have the capability to handle unhandled exceptions. So in your application object, you can attach an event handler to unhandled exceptions. Now, the difference here is that in Silverlight and other XAML platforms, there's usually a host. So in Silverlight, if you've ever seen the unhandled exception management, it creates a JavaScript message and throws it to IE, or whatever the browser host is, because that is actually the host that's hosting the runtime. In this case, there is no host. Your application is the host, so you're responsible for that. So this is just a simple trick that I do. And I just look for if the debugger is attached. Go ahead and break. So now if we run this application, this will only happen in debug mode, which is kind of what I want, right? Ideally, I should be handling unhandled exceptions, but this provides me at least a more visible and more familiar debugging experience on a single screen environment where I'm thrown back into the IDE, I'm aware of what's happening now, and I can see different things, inspect the exception that was thrown, etc. So the other type of exception is when you're dealing with WinRT API. So this button is going to launch the file picker. You've seen the file picker API that allows you to do, apps can register to be a part of a contract and show up in the file picker and things like that. So this code, let's just go ahead and look at it. This code just launches the file picker, right? I mean, it's an async call, calls the file picker. I say I want JPEGs, and it's going to launch the file picker. So I'm going to click that, and it didn't launch the file picker, and I don't know why. Again, if I go back and actually see the debug window, something was output. Now you notice that this actually currently didn't throw as an unhandled exception, and these are, again, we're in preview mode, so these are things that we're working on to get revised. But one thing that we can do in order to get these type of things, these kind of native exceptions up, is if you're a managed developer, you probably have never frequently used this exception window. So from the debug menu, choose exceptions, or in tools, options, debugging, you can use this method. And I recommend just, if you're doing serious debugging, just enable all these all these catches, because you are, in WinRT, you are working in a native world regardless of if you're using managed or native code. You will eventually hit the native boundary. So using that, and now if we add this, again, we get the more familiar experience where we're thrown back in the IDE, the exception message is right in front of our face, and we can see, the file extensions must begin with a dot and contain no wildcards. I can go back in here and correct my error, run the application, and get my file picker. So some quick helpful tips on just understanding how exceptions are handled and what you can do and what you should do for handling unhandled exceptions as well as the native exceptions. Did anyone go to Anders' talk? Anders fans? I turned down an opportunity to have dinner with him this week. As he invited me, I walked away and said, that was the dumbest thing I've ever done. So if you haven't noticed, everything in WinRT is async, right? Even down to reading files. And there's if you're new to async development, this can trip you up in understanding what's async and how do you deal with it, and how do you know when you're calling an async method, and how do you know when you can do things. If you're a Silverlight developer, this notion of the awaitable methods and iasync info type methods has not always been obvious to you, and the design of the core CLR for Silverlight and Silverlight in general was not designed for async in every method like WinRT is. So we've always had this thing that we call a dispatcher, right? So if I click a button and I'm calling a web service, that's actually happening on a different thread than the UI thread. And then if you want to actually modify something back on the UI thread, you'd have to dispatch that back to the correct thread. And that always has tripped people up, and so we've provided a dispatcher. And so I just wanted to show a couple things with regard to this of how you can be aware of certain things as well as use the dispatcher. So I have, again, just very simple things here. I'm going to use the HTTP client. And I'm just going to fetch some data. So the first thing, and if you went to Mads Torgenson's talk about async, he talks about the principles of async, both as an API developer. And one of the first principles is you should really name your APIs to help developers. And so we can see that this is a good example of that, right? So the function clearly is describing itself as async. So as you're developing things that are task-based APIs, make sure that you follow that guideline as well to help developers consume that. So I'm just going to do a new URI. Now, the other thing is, if you look at the tooltip in Visual Studio, the C# VB language service guys have done a really great job of understanding which APIs are task-based APIs and have provided that. So I don't know if a lot of people use the tooltips or pay attention to them, but as we've been going through the app building, this was very helpful to us before a lot of the API authors obviously made it clear and said get async. But you can see that the CLR and the language services in Visual Studio know what can be awaitable and what not, and they will always decorate and prepend the tooltip letting you know, hey, you're writing this code, and the way you're writing it, you can actually use the awaitable methods. So in seeing that, I can go ahead and follow that pattern now and say await, and I can type correctly, change it to async, and use that method. Okay, so I'm not going to cover what the principles of async are, but just noting that as you look at and identify async methods, pay attention to the tooltips and things like that that will help you determine when you can take advantage of that pattern and when it's helpful for you. So if we were to call this now, it's just going to call the method. The other thing is dispatcher. So there are some areas where you still are going to want to do things on your own, right? So you want to queue up your own background thread to do some processing, or you're doing different level, multi-level, multi-threaded type applications, and you still need to affect the UI. So this is a call here. This application I've previously run before, and I've used the new Password Vault API. Highly recommend that you look at that for storing things like tokens and user authentication. And so I've previously stored something in the Password Vault, which is for my application, and now I want to retrieve that password. So I'm calling this API, and I've decided I want to do it on a different thread, and then I want to just show my password. Now, this is not this particular API at the current time is not async, so I didn't get any tooltip or anything that told me it was awaitable. So if I click this button, nothing's showing up, and I'm frustrated, right? And all I know is that, and again, if I would have turned on the exceptions, my previous tip, I would have got thrown back in the IDE. But I just know that there's a COM exception here. And in fact, if I turn on exceptions, which I won't because it'll scare you, the current message is like catastrophic failure, you're going to die type message. So I know something's wrong, and I can see that, oh, I'm setting something back on the UI thread. This is a text block in my XAML, just some text right there. So what we can do is we still have a dispatcher available to you. Now, the signature is slightly different than previous platforms. This is a WinRT dispatcher. So in Silverlight, it's begin, invoke, and these different types of methods. I say it's only slightly different in that the signature is not identical. So if you're trying to port code, this is one area where you're probably going to have to do some if-def type things. So I can say dispatcher, I can give it a priority. I'll just give it a priority of normal. Give it some args. So what I'm doing here is I'm using the WinRT dispatcher that we're exposing. So this is the core dispatcher is the API that you want to take a look at. And this is actually not a XAML one, right? So this is in the Windows UI core dispatcher area. And it's available on, so I just did this.dispatcher, but it's available on any dependency object, right? So I'm just doing a very simple case here, but you may have very, very specific cases on DOs that you're working with that you want to dispatch from. So now that I've done that, if I run the application here, and now I'm able to do that, right? So we still have, you have two methods, making sure that you're using async APIs, using awaitable methods, which handles the synchronization context between the threads for you on your behalf in managed code, as well as if you need to or don't have the capability, the awaitable methods and things like that, to use the dispatcher to get back to that. Now, I should have prefaced, I'll be using C#, just more productive in that environment, but everything that I'm talking about applies to C++ as well. And in fact, this is an area where in C++, how the awaitable and async pattern that C# and VB provide is not identical in the C++ world. So dispatcher is going to be very important to you as a native code developer in using that method because you don't have the notion of await. Okay, let's talk about base URI. Any WPF developers in the room? Pack URI? Everybody love Pack URI? So Pack URI is, the concept is kind of very similar here. If you've been building applications so far in the preview, you may have been frustrated when you are trying to create a stream and you're providing a URI to some asset in your application. The most common thing is using image streams and things like that, and that's the demo that I'll show. So actually, let me just jump into it and talk through it while we go. So in this application here, I have two things. I have just a stack panel with two images. One is they're both using the image element. The first one, I'm setting the source declaratively, and you can see that I have two images here. I have one called Gorge JPEG and Jupiter JPEG. And so in the first one, I'm setting the source to a relative URI. To me, it's a relative URI. I'm setting it to images whack Gorge JPEG. And the other one, I'm just giving this a name that I can use later. So we're going to use a method on a button to load the second image. So let's go to that method. Now this should look familiar to you. It looks correct. I say, hey, here's an image source. Here's the URI. It's a relative type URI. I want to set I'm creating a new bitmap image, and I want to set the source of that space image to the bitmap source. So let's run this application. So what we'll see is the application is, the first picture is a beautiful picture of the Columbia River Gorge in the Portland area. And let's go ahead and try to load the second image here. And nothing happens, and I should be using my own tip and turning on exceptions all the time. So, but we can see that we have an exception here. And the exception is telling us that there's an argument exception. And in fact, let's go ahead and do that so we can see the details of this. If you've gone to any of the Windows Runtimes talks with Harry Pearson and Jesse Kaplan, if you haven't watched that one, I highly recommend that one if you're a managed code developer. That talks about the language projections. So this is an area where the URI that you are using is actually a projection of one of the WinRT APIs, in this case, Windows Foundation URI. Now, we can see clearly now the error message here. And what's happening is that URIs in WinRT cannot be relative. They must always be absolute. So what can you do as an application developer? Hey, I just have stuff in my project that I'm going to be using throughout the time. Well, we've done two things. We've provided an attribute on every framework element that's called base URI that you can inspect. It's a read-only. You can inspect it. And it will help you construct proper URIs. So in the URI builder and constructor, I can pass in this .base URI and then my relative path. Okay, so now if we run this application and we load the image, we can see that we get the proper image. Now let's see what's actually happening here. And so let's set a breakpoint on the URI, load it again. So if we look at the image source URI, you can see this is the URI. Has anyone had the opportunity to go to the Kip Knox's talk about resource management in WinRT? Okay, you will absolutely want to go to that talk, 100%, because you're probably wondering, what is MS-resource at this point? So for the XAML developers in the room, you can kind of draw a parallel to PackURI, and this is kind of the new notion of PackURI. MS-resource is a protocol that peeks into your package, your Apex package, so this is a runtime notion, and will properly determine the correct resource based on what you are providing for the request. I like to think of it as kind of like a DNS for resources, is that I'm basically calling into the resource manager and saying, I need this image called Jupyter PNG. And the resource manager in WinRT says, OK, I need to go look up what that actually is. What does that mean to me? Right? Does Yellow Pages look up and says, that actually is this path right here. So you as a developer don't need to know this explicit path all the time. I believe it is helpful to understand that. I'm not going into the details of the fragments here of what you're seeing, but it is helpful. So when you're doing things in code with URIs, understand the base URI concept. And again, it's available on every framework element. And so if you're deep in user controls and things like that, again, not just images, but if you're doing dynamic XAML load for controls and things like that, this will be very helpful. So you may be wondering, well, how did the first one work then, if I didn't have to specify an absolute URI here for the first image source? Well, what we are doing in the framework ourselves is that when you use declarative methods, the runtime and the parser automatically knows, and we always communicate with that resource manager. So whenever we see a relative URI, we're always communicating with the resource manager to return the proper URI. So if we were to actually inspect this visual tree in the wilderness image element, we would see the same thing. We would see that the actual source of that image is an ms-resource image with the proper base URI. Okay? Question? Question, sorry again? From a different assembly. So the question is, what if it's an absolute URI from a different assembly? I'd defer to Kip's talk to understand about what the resource manager is. I do have a localization chalk talk this afternoon where I can talk about that because we use the same method for localized resources. There's basically a method of understanding those fragments in the MS resource protocol. So that's the base URI concept. Very helpful, especially when you're doing things in code. Okay, Jensen talked about a lot of the new Metro-style things. One of the more prominent ones is the application bar. A lot of people have the tablets. You've probably been using different applications, and hopefully you're getting used to kind of flicking from, or swiping from the bottom and seeing the application bar. Most application bars are on the bottom. Things like the IE browser also have an application bar on the top, but that's the notion of the application bar. And so as you've been working with these applications, there's probably been a familiarity throughout those that there's a very consistent file, right? Or UI, that there's an ellipse, there's some type of glyph in the middle, and some type of label on the bottom. Now, do we have any phone developers in the room? A couple phone developers. The phone was kind of when the Metro design language was first introduced, right? And what was the first thing everybody was clamoring for was how do we get icons for our app bar and our application that look to these Metro kind of style look and feel. And so the phone team distributed a bunch of PNGs and vector art kind of outside of the box. So you had to go and find them and include them in your project, et cetera. And also there's I think it's called the Noun project, which has really great vector art that it looks like a Metro-style design. But we've done something in Windows 8 actually to help you along this as well. Because this is such a core area of a Metro-style application's UI design, and you'll see the concept of app bar and the specific implementations from a visual standpoint to ensure that your users have a consistent look and feel across their applications. So I have this application here, and let me just run it so I can have something to talk to. And so you can see on the left-hand side that I have, this is just a list view, and I've just bound it, and my data template is actually a text block. What you're seeing here is a text block. And so what we've done in Windows 8 is we're providing a new font file for you called Seago UI symbol. So I guess we chose Wingdings 4 was not going to be cool enough, right? So we went Seago UI symbol. And there is a specific Unicode range in the symbol font. There's of course many symbols in there. A lot of them are used for the OS. Some of them are private use areas. But there's a public use area of a specific Unicode range. And this is the current range and the preview bits that you have that provide these high quality font-based glyphs for your application bar. So we have all these available for you. We think these are the most, some of the very most common ones that will exist. We're continuing to evaluate what we add to this. A lot of this is based, actually, if you look at this compared to the Windows Phone 7 assets that are available for download, there's only 3 missing, and that's just because I forgot to tell them that there were 3 missing. So that's already been resolved, but these map directly and in fact are the same vector art base as the phone. So how would we use these? And just to show how simple it is here and why and the benefits you would get out of using this method. And actually, let me just describe what you just saw here. So I just had a simple text block, and I'm saying the font family is Seago UI symbol. This is not a font that you have to embed in your application. It's on the OS. It's guaranteed to be on the OS. I set a font size, and I'm just binding to the value. And so for this demonstration, I just iterated over the Unicode range. So it's E100 to, technically it's E124, but if you do your Unicode math, it's, the numbers stop at E118 because there's a range that uses letters in there. But anyhow, this is just an iteration of that. And so I'm just setting the Unicode value. If you had a specific one, you can do, and you knew the Unicode value, this is how you would do it there. We definitely understand that discoverability of Unicode values translated to glyphs is an issue. And so we're trying to resolve that. Let me show you one method that we've been using in our apps. So all the XAML apps, the XAML sample apps that you have on your tablet are using this method. I've got a custom control here. So I've got a control. This is my app bar button. And I've got a generic XAML that defines that button here. And so I'm going to use this control. Now, let me give you another quick tip that isn't on my list, but we'll talk about it. So this is how you declare custom controls, user controls, when you're going to use them declaratively, is you provide your own XML namespace. I just choose local. That's a very frequent one. If it's local to the project, it could be foo, whatever. It doesn't matter what the second thing on the colon is. But then I have to provide it, like, what namespace am I working with? Now, in other XAML platforms, you would do this, and then the namespace, right? Well, not namespace D, but namespace. We don't support that currently in WinRT XAML, and we've changed to say using. So this is another tip, kind of a difference that you need to be aware of when declaratively using custom controls and user controls. Don't use the CLR namespace moniker, use the using attribute. And we've done that because of your custom control can be a WinRT type and not a CLR type. So I've declared that control. And then we go ahead now and put an application bar in. We have an actual application bar element for you. And so I'm just going to create one that is has a horizontal stack panel in there. And I will use my build my project. For some reason, it's not finding it. I need to clear it. Oh, using, sorry. That's not right. Keyboard not cooperating. Yeah, that was right. So preview mode. So I have defined here, so I had my custom control, and I'm going to comment out a bunch of these styles here. And these are all styles that map to those Unicode ranges. So what I've done is I've just defined some base styles and then some specific styles, so I can just say, hey, I've got this button, and I want it to be the play button. And so I will say, here's the static resource, app bar, play icon, and my button has a dependency property called play. Oh, duh. That's what you were telling me. So now if I bring up the app bar, by using that glyph and a custom control with a couple simple properties, I get a very specific and predictable application bar. Now, why this is important to consider is, let's go in, and if you went to my session talking about pixel density, let's turn everything at a higher DPI, and let's go back to my application and run it again. And you can see that I've gotten really, really nice vector scaling. So the font does the scaling automatically for me. There's no pixelation. I can go to a super high font value and get the benefits out of that. So if I had a PNG and I wanted to do this mechanism, and I wanted to make sure that I adapted for pixel density, which you would, then you would have to make sure that you provide 3 PNGs for that particular image to adapt to the different pixel density layers. But by using the glyph and the symbol font, I don't have to do that. So we'll continue to evaluate and expand that range of of symbol fonts for you to use. But again, just a quick tip, app bar is such a prevalent feature in Metro style applications that's something that you should consider using. And again, I just was able to use a very quick style to apply to different ones. So I can use that same control that I had and just change out the static resource depending on the type that I wanted there. Question? Yeah, so the question was, can I use the using stuff with any object, or does it have to be a control namespace? So it's any time where you're declaring a specific namespace. So if you had like a data context or something, I'm assuming that's what you're asking for, right? Maybe a view model resource locator or something, yeah? Yeah, you would use the same mechanism. Yes, there are some current issues, yes. We did say preview, right? Okay, cool. Okay, the next one is how to localize XAML content. Now, I do have a chalk talk on this, and let me turn this off. But I wanted to show this very quickly. We've done some work here to hopefully introduce a better localization story for XAML. Now, let me show the XAML here. I have a text block that just shows hello world. If we were to run this application, you would expect to see hello world in 72-point font. Now, I have these folders here that have a BCP47 tag for my locale. And you see this file in here called resources.resw. And I'll explain that in my chalk talk, and I won't go into depth here. But if we were to open one, there's values in there. It looks like resx, et cetera. So let me run this application, and we should see what we expect. Hello world. So now let's go in, and let's add one value here. I'm going to add UID and give it a UID value, and now we'll run the application. Now you see the text is welcome to build. It's not hello world. So what happened there? If we go back into our project and look at these resw files, this resource, I have a resource with a name, the name value collection in the resources, and the key is welcome text.text. So if we recall, our UID was welcome text, and the property text. So we're providing a mechanism for you to declare in your resource files attributes that you want to localize in your text. So if I were to change my language at this point, and make my language list preference to be German first and English second, and now rerun the application. I'm not changing any of my XAML, but you can see that now I have a different message, different text was rendered. And that's because in my German resource, I have the same attribute, and now I'm providing a different value. But you saw that text was clipped, right? So that wasn't ideal for my German users. So I can go in my German resource and say, welcome text wrapping, wrap. So I'm just changing my attributes in the resource file, not my XAML, and I'm able to get this. Thank you. So I'll go into a deeper dive again in the chalk talk this afternoon. If you're very interested in localization, we realize this is a different mechanism than other XAML platforms, and there's a little bit more to it. I'm happy to talk to it, but we think this is a good, simple method for doing simple declarative-based localization. I better change back to English before I can't read anymore. Okay, so being able to bind HTML content to WebView. So we have a control called WebView that allows you to render HTML content. Let's take a look at that. And in here, I have an application that has a list view that's doing some binding to an RSS feed. And then I have a web view that when you select that, I want you to display, the data context is going to be the selected item. And ideally, I would want to display the HTML. So let me go ahead and run this application here. So this is Steven Sinofsky's blog. I'm going to get the information. select this item, and we can see that nothing's showing here. This is our web view control. So let's go ahead and figure out how we can do this here. So I'm going to go into, and I've just commented out my fetch logic because it's not entirely important. But what I'm going to do here is WebView follows the same API as the web browser control in Silverlight. So we have a method for navigating to a URI as well as navigating to string content. Now, obviously, in like a view model world where you're setting data context and you're binding to properties, actually calling APIs from the view or calling these navigate methods is not entirely ideal. It kind of breaks the model of your data context flow. So what we can do is add a helper method here, which is basically a dependency property, or sorry, an attached property that's called HTML. And on the property changed event here for the dependency property, I'm using that API. So I'm just saying navigate to string. So now what I can do in my XAML is, again, I have to use the using syntax. Let me build this. And now I can say local WebView helper HTML binding to content. So I'm using an attached property to give me an entry point that I can bind information to. And so if I select this, sorry, was there a question? No? So when I select this, now that HTML content, I can set it as a property, and it actually does what it needs to do and display the content. And obviously, this isn't ideal. This is the default rendering, a white screen and Times New Roman. But I own that method. So if I wanted to change some things here, I have a style. I can go ahead and alter that HTML as I'm setting the value. Let's move that for here. Because I'm not using a URI and I'm just setting content, I control that style, so I can apply things as I want to it. So a simple method and using an attached property to enable you to use binding methods for HTML content on the web view. Okay, so you may have also seen this concept of a settings panel. Have you guys been working with applications that you've seen the settings panel as you swipe from the right edge and you bring up the charms bar? One of the charms bar is the settings panel. Now, real quick, I wanted to show a mechanism, and this is not going to be bulletproof for every application, but the settings panels are meant to be light. They're meant to be contextual to the view that their user is looking at. So I wanted to show a quick method that you could do this in XAML fairly quickly. So let's go into our page here. And this is how you wire up the settings commands. This is not the detail here, but you basically get the settings pane for the current view. Again, settings should be contextual to the view that the user is looking at. And then I can add a command. So I just create a new command. There's some built-in commands that you can use, like about, preferences, etc. I'm just creating one called my custom settings, and calling, when that is selected, I'm calling this API called show settings panel. Now, I don't have the show settings panel yet. You can see that I'm using the local moniker again, and I have this user control here, which is, there's nothing in it. It's just a red rectangle with some text, just so we can illustrate the purposes here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use that settings panel, and I'm going to set it to the right. Now there's two designs for the settings panel that are in the UI guidelines. One is 346 pixels wide, and the other is 646 pixels wide. So that's why I'm choosing this specific number here. So what I'm doing is I'm setting it off margin from the screen, and I need to give it an X name. And so in this call, what I want to do is when somebody clicks the settings charm for my application, I want to bring that into view. And so let's show this. So a keyboard shortcut to get to the settings charm is Windows I. We'll bring up the settings-specific charm. Otherwise, you would just get to it from here as well. And so you can see that I have my custom settings. All of this is a shell-owned window. All of this is drawn for you with the exception of this. So when I click that, I get my custom settings dialog that shows up in kind of a prescribed way. But it didn't really come in the exact way that the setting, the UI guidelines dictate, and I have no way to dismiss it, right? This kind of light dismiss model. So there's a couple things that we can do. If you saw Olner's talk, we can use the pointer events. And so now what I'm going to do here is just when anywhere else is clicked on the application, if the settings panel is out, then I basically just want to set it back to the place where it should be. So I'm basically kind of faking my own light dismiss. But the other thing I want to do is give this some personality. I want to give it the Windows personality. So I can add, if you went to John's talk and talked about transitions, what we are doing here is we are actually repositioning the content, right? We're changing the margin. So I can go into my user control and add a reposition transition, and that's a built-in animations library transition. And because I'm changing the margin, which will reposition it, I will get that animation for free. I don't have to create my own storyboard or anything. So let's bring up the settings. I'll trigger the settings. You can see how it came in. And if I fake my light dismiss, it goes out. So if we look at an example of this, how we've implemented it. So this is Sudoku. I have two options here. I have my game options. I provide a very specific UI for my application. I can set the values. A settings pane, you can see that there's no commit, there's no OK cancel. The UI guideline is that settings are instant to the view that you're working on. There's no kind of undo. So as I change the game helpers on and off, that literally affects the live view of the game, and I can dismiss that and the operations happen. So that's one mechanism of how you can use user controls to do a settings panel. This is an area that we're exploring on obviously how to do that better. Again, this is not a bulletproof method for every application, but and especially since the way that I'm showing it here is it is live in the visual tree, you could do things where as that settings command was clicked, that then you add it to the visual tree and do the repositioning to get the effect as well. But settings should be light. There shouldn't be, they shouldn't be another application. So for the most part, your visual tree shouldn't be that large with regard to the settings. Okay, decoding pixels. So I'm running short on time. Let me just go through this one fairly quickly. And for this, I do want the frame rate counter. So I have this application that shows, just allows me to load a picture. And I apologize if you can't totally see the frame rate counter on one of the screens. But we're gonna choose this picture. You can see this is a 4 megabyte picture. But in my XAML, I'm just displaying a 100 by 100 image element. So it doesn't really make sense for me. Well, let's see what happens. So let's look at the memory usage is 2059 right now. I'm going to select the 4 meg picture. I need to trigger the frame rate counter to wake up again. And so we're now at 9227, right? So we've significantly increased in memory utilization for this application. And I'm not even using the pixels that are being shown in this image, right? So I've just completely wasted memory. So we've added on bitmap image two properties, decode pixel height, and obviously decode pixel width. So by setting these properties, we're saying, hey, we're only displaying at this value. We should really only decode at this value. We don't need all the pixels because we're not using them all. So let's go ahead and only decode what we need. So we start at 2059. We'll choose our 4 meg image again. And now we're at 5131. So the difference between 9 megs and 5 megs by being able to just set those two properties. Now, just to be clear, that property is just for decoding, right? So if I do a web request out to Flickr and the image is 8 billion pixels wide and 50 gigs in file size, this doesn't help you, right? This only helps you when you actually get the 50 gigs down to your machine that you don't need to decode all of those pixels. So you still are paying the cost in retrieving from wherever your source is these large images. It's not I can fetch only the pixels I want. I'm displaying and decoding only the pixels I want. So this will give you not only better memory utilization, but better perf in your application if you're doing a lot of these things where you're showing an image that you may not know what the correct resolution is, or not need that full resolution. OK, I've got 4 minutes left with the last one. How many people have done OAuth? Has anyone gone to any of the web sessions where they've talked about web authentication? A few people? Awesome. So I've been working a lot with OAuth lately. And I would imagine as your Metro-style application as well, you will too, in using a lot of the public services. And I've found that keeping a box of forks next to me, so every time I use it, I can just gouge my eye out every time I work with OAuth, is very helpful. And especially as a client application, with OAuth 1, what you've always had to do is this constant handshake back and forth. I have to tell you, here's my request token. The service comes back and says, are you who you really say you are? Yes, I am. And then they come back and say, no, really, are you really who you say you are? And in the client application, sometimes that involves a PIN code, not an ideal user experience for your customers, where you launch your application and say, oh, now go to this website, and then come back and tell me what the PIN was, and they might enter it wrong and things like that. So what we've done in WinRT is provided an API for you to be able to do OAuth simpler. So I have just this again, simple XAML. I have a button that I'm going to log into my Facebook account. I have a text block where I'm going to show my token. And I have a list view where I'm going to show the feeds from my Facebook account. So I probably shouldn't have announced that. So anyone who writes vulgar stuff on my Facebook, I'll smack you. And so what we're going to do is I've hidden a couple things like my Facebook key and things like that. But the thing that is still required is most OAuth providers, you have to create a request URI. That is the starting point to the handshake. And then it gets cumbersome from there. So this is I'm newing up a Facebook-specific URI. This is just a URI. We'll just keep it at that. And, everyone has a starting point. Every service's starting point is different. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to say I want the response. And this is an async method. And I'm going to use the web authentication broker and say authenticate async. I'm going to use the default options. The request URI is the one that I've built up. And I'm going to provide it a callback URI, which is Facebook's specific callback URI. Now I'm going to just say, hey, if the response was successful, I want to set a global property. I want to get the data. And I have an extension method to get out the specific token from the response. So parse token is not something that's WinRT. That's my extension method. And we will display this so we can validate. And then I'm going to call this method load my feeds, which is a Facebook method that requires authentication. And I'm just hiding this because it's not important to hear, but it's a method that requires authentication, so I need my token to be able to do that. And that's it. So if I run this application, I'll click the button log into Facebook, have my Facebook login, provide my information, say log in, there's my token, There's my feeds. So I hope this will be very helpful. This window is completely provided for you. This is a shell-provided window. You don't have to provide your own view. You don't have to provide XAML. This is going to display the response of that request URI. And so I just said, authentication broker, authenticate me. And this is what I got out of it. And it starts the handshake process for me. Now, Facebook is an OAuth 2 provider, so it is very simple and very brain-dead simple here. Windows Live is an OAuth 2 provider, so the Live SDK for Metro-style apps has been discussed here. So if you're doing things with SkyDrive and things like that, it will be as simple as this. Things like Groupon is a OAuth 2 provider. Twitter is still on OAuth 1, so there are a couple more handshakes that you have to do to process, but to get your initial view and your initial tokens to start that handshake is still as simple as this. So I've run out of time. I thought that we would have time for questions, but I'm happy to answer questions. Again, thanks for coming on the last day in the morning. I'll sit here for a few minutes to answer questions, but there is another session following, so I'll be happy to meet anybody in the expo hall afterwards. So hopefully these tips have been useful for you. There's certainly much more, but these are some of the things that we've done in app building to find it useful so far in our app. So thank you again for coming. I appreciate it.